Do you want? This is a good time. Unless there's anything else you want to add here. Is there anything? Can you talk about the smaller, quote unquote, scare quote, Sadducee canon?
Yeah.
I take the position that the Sadducees didn't have a different canon. I didn't know what your thoughts were.
Right. Now, in my book, what I had brought up, because it was written for the benefit of a Catholic audience, because Catholics are the ones that believe that the Sadducees had a smaller canon and only espoused to the 5 books of Moses, that they had rejected the prophets. But as I mentioned in my cross-examination with Trent Horn, I says, well, do you have any evidence prior to or contemporary with the time of Christ that the Sadducees had the smaller canon? And his response was, well, it's a general accepted belief in New Testament studies. Well, that's not what I had asked him. He kind of danced around it. And then I said, isn't it true that it's not till about the 3rd century that it's Jerome and others who are the ones who theorized, this? And it's funny because in the post-debate interview, Gary Michuta had actually said that Trent was the one that brought up Origen and Epiphanius. And I'm like, no, that was actually me that said that. And the argument was, the fact is, we don't get this understanding until the 3rd century of the Christian era. And as Beckwith points out, part of the reason was because after the temple was destroyed, the Sadducees had lost their authority, of being head of the temple and temple sacrifice. And there are writings that the Sadducees and might have actually blended in with the Samaritans because they didn't really have a home. And in early writings, they a lot of times will conflate Sadducees and Samaritans. And since we know Samaritans only embrace those 5 books, it's believed that the Sadducees did as well.
Well, I think later in history, the Sadducees kind of merged with the Samaritans. They were kind of the liberal Protestants of their day.
Exactly.
Or the liberal Catholics, and the liberals have a lot of common cross denominations.
Right, and the other point that I brought up to Trent, I says another thing too is that we actually have writings from the Sadducees who try to disprove the resurrection by quoting Job. Well, Job was not one of the 5 books of Moses. And then Trent says, yeah, but it's believed that Moses might have written Job. But Job was not part of the Torah. That's the whole point. So I'm surprised that he used that argument.
Well, from what I understand, what happened is that Josephus mentioned that they didn't accept the anything besides the law of Moses.
Right.
And in context, I think what Josephus was talking about, because he also says all Jews accept the canon of the 22 books,
right,
obviously I think that's a little bit hyperbolic because, there's always going to be an aberrant group somewhere, right? Maybe the Essenes, who knows? And we're not even sure about them, but
we're not.
There might be some schismatic. It'd be like saying, "Oh, well, the Christian Scientists over here." Who cares? Origen misunderstood Josephus because Josephus was talking about oral law, and then I think of a lot of it was also, and this gets even to the Malachi thing, because if you talk to a Jew, it's not so much talking about the canon, but like, where are the rules? Okay. Oh, it's from Moses. That's why they're talking. So I think Origen misunderstood that. And then over on top of that, because they didn't believe in angels and resurrection and stuff, it's so clear in Daniel that most people probably think that backs that up. But the thing is that it doesn't. Isn't necessarily the case, because the Sadducees, if you think of them as like, a Unitarian minister, or let's say a liberal Presbyterian, or Father James Martin, to be funny to our Catholic listeners, just because it's just because it's clear in Daniel doesn't mean they can't just like wave it away as like this is allegory. Maybe it's what Trent Horn does with Judith or something. It's like, this, because there's angels in the
Genesis.
Torah, and they didn't believe in angels, right?
Right.
So just because there's clearly angels in Genesis, so if we're going to follow that argument, then they must have not believed in the Torah too, right? Either that or they're theologically liberal.
Right. And the other thing too is they didn't believe in a resurrection either. They allegorized that as well. And the resurrection is really clear in the prophets, and so that's another reason why I think that they might have rejected. But what does Jesus do when the Sadducees bring up the idea of the resurrection? He doesn't correct them from the prophets. He goes back to Exodus. He goes back to the Torah and says, "Have you not read?" And then he explains that God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he actually uses Exodus as evidence for the resurrection.
Yeah, so some would think that means they didn't view Daniel, but like when Jesus is standing in front of the high priest, he uses Daniel in the Son of Man passage.
Right. Exactly. Brought that up during the debate. Why does he use Daniel? Why does he use Jonah when he in front of the Sadducees when he says, "I'll be just as Jonah was in the belly of the great fish for 3 days and 3 nights." Well, Jonah was part of the prophets. It was not part of the Torah.
So the books of the law, right? So if the books of Scripture were laid up in the temple, who was in charge of the temple?
Yeah,
it was the Sadducees.
It was the Sadducees, exactly. It was the Sadducees that were in charge of it. And I don't think they would have only had the 5 books of Moses, because Josephus actually says there's 22 books. He names virtually all of them, not all of them, but mostly all of them. And the only way you get to 22 books is to include books in the writings, including Esther and Song of Solomon and the rest of them, which are enumerated later, I believe, by Melito and definitely by Origen.